It was there. This began on March 6th. Discovered that Mark's past wasn't quite as clean as.
Have you ever tried shooting a low-light, dimly lit scene? You're exposed for the mood that you want, maybe you bump up the ISO a little bit, but no matter what you do, it always looks noisy to a degree. But then you look at movies like The Social Network or The Batman, just to name two, and they look freaking clean. And it makes you want to throw away your dual native ISO camera because you bought it mainly for its low light capabilities. But seriously, how do we turn this into this? How about we shatter some myths? Brace yourself, because maybe everything you thought you knew about exposing to the right, ISO, low light, and noise could be completely off track. To begin, it's crucial that we dismiss the notion that ISO directly affects exposure. While it's true that ISO does have an impact on exposure, the effect isn't really straightforward. Essentially, ISO affects our judgment of exposure, but it doesn't alter the amount of light actually hitting the camera sensor. The only two variables that truly dictate how much light will reach the sensor are the aperture of the lens and the shutter speed. So, to make the concept simple, every camera has a sensor, and that sensor captures light and turns it into an electrical charge that is then converted into a digital value. The sensor has a certain dynamic range. A camera applies ISO amplification to the signal after the signal is already been recorded by the sensor. It doesn't actually alter how much light the sensor received in the first place. So ISO doesn't really affect exposure, but it biases us to expose a certain way. I'll give you an example by making an analogy with audio recording. Imagine that you are an audio engineer and you're recording a singer, and you make the headphones volume very loud. This represents the ISO. Given the high volume, you may be biased towards decreasing the input level of the mic, and that represents the amount of light hitting the camera sensor. So, in this analogy, you are underexposing the sensor. And the opposite is true. If the volume of the headphones is very low, you're going to make the input level of the mic higher, thus recording a stronger level, hence overexposing the sensor. Basically, changing the ISO value works like an amplifier. We have a signal and we can either boost it or not, but we can't change the nature of the signal once it's been captured by the sensor. So, to demonstrate that ISO is just an amplification of the signal and not an actual increase of the light hitting the sensor, I recorded a scene at 3 different ISO values, 400, 800, and 1600, without changing any other variable. So the aperture of the lens and the shutter speed remain the same all throughout. And you could say, well, they look different. Jimmy, how can you say that ISO doesn't change exposure? I mean, look at this. Yes, but we didn't change the amount of light on the actual scene. If we take ISO 800 as our reference, for the 2 other ISO settings, 1600 and 400, the camera just amplified the signal more for ISO 1600 and amplified the signal less for ISO 400 compared to ISO 800. And in fact, if we adjust the 3 images to match the brightness level of the ISO 800 image, well, they look exactly the same. ISO 1600 isn't noisier than ISO 800 if pulled back by 1 stop, and ISO 400 doesn't look any cleaner than ISO 800 if pushed by 1 stop. And that's because through these adjustments, we've effectively made all 3 images as if they were shot at ISO 800. We basically changed the amplification of the signal in post instead of doing it in camera. So with this out of the way, how do we make our dark and moody images cleaner? Well, this is where exposing to the right comes into play. Exposing to the right means to give the sensor a healthy amount of light to work with. But after everything we've said, it should be clear that if you're exposing to the right by raising the ISO, you're not really exposing to the right. You're just boosting the signal. And in fact, by raising the ISO, not only you're not exposing to the right, but you're probably exposing to the left. Exposing to the right isn't a digitally bound practice. If you ever shot film, even for photos, you probably heard the term thick negative. Exposing to the right is what you would do with film and what DOPs did for a long time to get richer and cleaner images when working with film. They would rate the film stock 1 stop slower than nominal, so they could print down a thicker negative to bring it back to normal exposure. If you're confused, I'll explain. So if you have a 500 ISO negative, you would meter it as if it was 250. So you would increase the light levels or open up the iris or a combination of both to expose for ISO 250. But you are actually recording at ISO 500. So you are effectively and constantly overexposing by exactly one stop. Then you take that overexposed image and you bring it down by one stop in the printing process. The resulting image will be cleaner and richer than the same image shot at ISO 500 and exposed for ISO 500. Because by printing down, or in digital by lowering the brightness of the image in post, you're not only making the image darker, you're also pushing the noise floor down, which will yield a cleaner image. So the concept is very simple. To get a clean image, especially for moody shots, even if it sounds counterintuitive, you should have more light on the scene. And to have more light on the scene, you should use a lower ISO setting, which is going to force you to compensate by actually using more light, or by opening up the iris, or by messing up with the shutter speed, but that's going to change motion blur. So mainly by increasing the light levels and opening up the iris on the lens. So that sounds great. So the more I overexpose, the more I can bring it down in post, the cleaner the image that I will get. Yes, but there's a catch, because by overexposing or using a lower ISO, you're sacrificing highlights latitude, meaning that the highlights will clip faster. But why is that? It's confusing, right? Why do we lose highlights detail with a low ISO setting? Well, go back for a moment to the single recording example. If we have a high headphones level, the ISO, we're going to decrease the input level of the mic, which is going to leave us with a lot of headroom before audio clipping. While if the headphones level is very low, we're going to turn the mic level all the way up to compensate, and the signal is going to be closer to the clipping point, and it's going to eventually clip if there's a peak. Take a look at this. I'm exposing for the gray patch here to have it always exposed at the same IRE level. And we also have a bright light bulb right next to it. Look what happens if we expose at ISO 200, 400, 800, and 1600. The exposure on the gray patch doesn't change, but look at the bulb as we bump up the ISO. Remember, we increase the headphones level and we get further away from the clipping point. Look how much more detail there is in the bulb if we expose at ISO 1600 compared to ISO 200 or 400. Obviously, we get more noise in the shadows, but we also get a lot more information in the highlights, because a high ISO level is going to bias you to underexpose the image, thus gaining more highlights information. So at the end of the day, there's no magic here. The camera, it's always going to have the same amount of dynamic range, and you're going to have to decide where you want the trade-off to be. With some cameras, changing the ISO will change the dynamic range slightly, but with most cinema cameras, this is not the case. Anyway, you're going to have to decide where you want the camera to perform at its best. Do you want very clean shadows by accepting to lose highlights detail? Or do you want to be able to get more highlights detail but more noise in the shadows? What's the answer? Well, it depends on the situation and on the type of scene that you're trying to capture. If you're trying to capture a low light moody scene where there's no super bright highlights, or you don't care if they're clipped, then lowering the ISO will probably be a good choice. Very clean shadows, not much to record in the highlights anyway, seems pretty reasonable to me. The opposite might be true if you're shooting outdoor in a bright sunny day, or you want to retain all the details in the sky during a beautiful sunset. Then raising the ISO a bit will be super beneficial. You will gain some headroom in the highlights, which you will need. You'll also get more noise in the shadows, but if the bulk of the image lives in the midtones and in the highlights, then who cares? I personally like shooting with my Sony FX3 at ISO 400 for low light scenes, like the ones that you saw in the intro of the video, and the 800 for daylight scenes where I can take advantage of the extra stop of information in the highlights. I personally never use the second native ISO of 12,800 because it always looks unusably noisy to me. That increase in sensitivity introduces what's called photon shot noise that is noticeable not in the shadows but more in the lower mid-range, which for me is very annoying. So am I saying that high ISO settings don't have a usage for a low light situation? Well, if you can control the amount of light that's actually hitting the sensor by opening up the iris or by increasing the light levels on set, then it's better to do so. If you can't, then raising the ISO to get an image that it's not pitch black is the only option you have. And as technology improves, you're going to be able to use high ISO settings without having to worry too much about noise. So to sum it up, remember that the ISO setting that you choose doesn't really affect your exposure directly. It affects how you expose your image. I hope that I made the concept clear enough, because talking to people, I realized that a lot of them were confused about this subject. And if I wasn't clear enough, feel free to ask any question in the comments down below. I'll be happy to answer you. And if you like this video, well, you know what to do. Please like, share, and subscribe. And until next time.